Chapter 13, a bottle of wine. Here we go. It opens with, as weeks followed. So we're getting this progression of time, and you'll notice that we get that at the beginning a lot of the chapters now. It's not just the next day, it's not the next few hours. We're getting a lot of time progressing in significant chunks as we begin each chapter. And he makes mention here that it's clear to Bruno that he would not be going home to Berlin in the foreseeable future. So he's resigned himself to the fact that he's stuck here for a little while. And that's one of the reasons why he's happy to go off on these little adventures and get used to some of the routines and the patterns of life. And he's pretty much, he's starting to forget about, starting to not so much miss Carl and Daniel and Martin because they're not part of his life anymore. It's almost like you have that out of sight, out of mind sort of notion going on there. All right, so we stop feeling unhappy about his new life, and he keeps referring to it still as his new life. And we progress through, and with this sort of bottle of wine chapter here, there are different elements of it. Usually the chapters focus on one thing, one aspect, one element, but there are multiple events occurring in some of these chapters from now on. So it does get a little bit more confusing in terms of the names of the chapters. And here we see Bruno wishing to ask Maria a question because he's been pondering this character Pavel and the role that he plays and some of the things that he said before. And that's common for children because sometimes something will happen to them at some stage and they'll think about that on and off for weeks on end, potentially. And all of a sudden, they pipe up with a question. It just sort of comes out in a different way. And that's, I suppose, really what we've got going on here. Anyway, so Bruno wants to know what's going on with Pavel. Here we go. And the question, and it's a fair way into the chapter now. You see I've skipped ahead about 3 pages of this size text. And Bruno wants to ask Maria the question. Pavel is not a doctor anymore, said Maria quietly, but he was in another life before he came here. And this to Bruno is really odd. Okay, and it says here, Bruno frowned and thought about it. I don't understand, he said. And what you have to understand about children and how they learn is that what will eventually happen is they will come across information that doesn't fit with their current understanding of the world. And then they process that information and they come to a new understanding of the world. And that's what's going on here. A lot of the information that Bruno gets presented, particularly in the next few chapters, is about this learning, this steep learning curve for him. Because as you know, he's established as this very naive character at the very beginning. And I think Maria's response here really says something. When Bruno says, I don't understand, she responds with, few of us do. So even someone like Maria, who works in this household, understands more about what's going on than what most people would, she still doesn't agree. She still doesn't really understand what's going on there. So it's strange that she responds in that way. And then we kind of get this secretive relationship occurring here. If I tell you what Pavel told me about his life, she said, you mustn't tell anyone. Do you understand? We would all get into terrible trouble. So even people in this household, people in this family have to protect themselves from the Nazis. No one is safe, is what that's implying there. So they keep even, I suppose, looking over themselves, making sure that no one within their own group, their own party, their own ranks are doing the wrong sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons why the Nazis were so successful in what they did, because no one could stand up to them. No one could prevent them from achieving their goals. Okay? And this links in nicely to one of the earlier chapters where Bruno clearly does have a close relationship with Maria. He's honest with her, more so than with some of the other characters in the text. All right, and then he obviously decides that he's going to keep visiting Shmuel and finding out a little bit more about this particular character. And he makes his way down to their usual meeting place and says, "Sorry I'm late," he said, handing some of the bread and cheese through the wire, the bits that he hadn't already eaten on the way when he'd grown a little peckish after all, talking to Maria. Now, what does this imply? I mean, all he's doing here is basically saying that his needs are still more important than Shmuel's. Like, he visits Shmuel and he knows that he's this skinny, sickly-looking fellow who really doesn't have anywhere near the same sort of life that he does, and Bruno still doesn't quite get how much he needs the food more than Bruno does, okay? Because he's this sort of chubby, well-fed, well-maintained child. And even on his way there, so it's what, about an hour walk, maybe not even quite that, and in that time he gets peckish and needs to, munch on this bread and cheese that he's meant to be giving to Shmuel. So I don't think Bruno really gets the significance of Shmuel's situation here. And they continue with their small talk. They don't really have deep and meaningful conversations, but every so often you get a real perler of a quote coming through, and we do get a little bit of tension between some of these two characters every so often as well. And Shmuel eats the bread and the cheese sort of very quickly. And he's asking him about all sorts of different things and telling him about Bruno's life. And of course, Bruno doesn't get it when Shmuel doesn't know who Pavel is. And he responds, I don't think you realise just how many people live on this side of the fence, said Shmuel. There are thousands of us. And again, that's not a situation Bruno's ever come across before. And he doesn't get it. And it's important that Shmuel has identified that very eloquently and clearly for us. And he continues and sort of gives us a little bit more background information, saying most people are from Poland, some people are from places like Czechoslovakia. There's a whole mixture of people there. Okay. And then we get this quote here. The soldiers don't normally like people getting better, said Shmuel, swallowing the last piece of bread. It usually works the other way around. So in terms of their understanding of the world, complete opposites here. Bruno understands that if he gets sick or unwell, people will be there to look after him. Shmuel knows the opposite. If you're sick or unwell, then you're a target to be killed because you're no longer productive, you're no longer useful. So completely different ideals represented in that quotation right there. And I love this next question. I know I say that a lot, but it's one of the interesting things about this book, how innocent it is. Do you know what you want to be when you grow up? He asked. And the irony there is that, well, neither of them are going to grow up because they die together at the end of the text. But it's a real childish sort of question, and it's something that we constantly ask ourselves or get asked as children. And Shmuel's response is, yes, I want to work in a zoo, which is really sort of a thoughtful response to that question. He likes being around animals, obviously must have a very caring sort of nature and that sort of thing. I think people who like animals possess those sorts of qualities. And Bruno's response, I'm going to be a soldier, said Bruno in a determined voice, like father. And we get the feeling that he's not really making that decision on his own. He doesn't really have any idea what his father does as a soldier. He doesn't really know what a soldier's life is like. He's just, I suppose, consumed by that world and thinks that that's the answer that he's supposed to give, which is often the case. And it's not uncommon for children to follow in the footsteps of their fathers, particularly in this day and age, where people often pass down their skills, their knowledge to their children, and their children would follow in their footsteps in the work world. And Shmuel's response, this is where we start to get a little bit of conflict here. I wouldn't like to be a soldier, said Shmuel. And Bruno classifies different levels of soldiers here. He goes, I don't mean one like Lieutenant Coulter. I mean one like father, one of the good soldiers. And then Shmuel's response, which kind of mirrors what we would think, there aren't any good soldiers, said Shmuel. And when you think about it, that's a pretty good, it's a pretty good analysis of the sorts of people that are involved in this sort of conflict. So you can't really say that any of them were good soldiers. Okay. And of course, it gets to the point where Shmuel has to repeat himself. And he's probably a little bit more emphatic when he delivers it this time. There aren't any good soldiers, repeated Shmuel. Except father, repeated Bruno. He's not going to let go. Bruno doesn't want to give up. Bruno still believes that his father is a good person, is a good soldier. And who wouldn't? Not many children of Bruno's age would go, yeah, you're right, my father isn't actually a very good soldier and he's doing a really bad job and I don't like what he's doing here. No kid's going to do that because of the connection that they have. And of course, after being quiet for a little while, because they don't really want to offend each other, they're the only friends really that each other have, which is really odd, isn't it? And eventually Shmuel sort of reveals how this situation has sort of come about. You don't know what it is like here. Okay? And of course, we know that to be true. So it's probably another good example of dramatic irony there, where we get it, Shmuel gets it, but Bruno just doesn't understand. Okay? So that's why we would refer to it as a bit of dramatic irony. And Bruno tries to sort of shift the focus again, trying to just get the conversation back underway and talking about his sister and saying, you don't have any sisters, you don't know what it's like, don't know how hard it is, she's a hopeless case, yada, yada, yada. And then there's this mention of Lieutenant Kotler, which Shmuel sort of cringes at. I don't like talking about him, says Shmuel. About who, asked Bruno. Lieutenant Coulter, he scares me. And Bruno reveals that he scares him too a little bit and calls him a bully. And I suppose that is how we would classify a lot of the Nazi soldiers. That's how we would sort of describe a lot of their sort of actions really within the text. Good. And then, of course, they're going to, later on, go and have some dinner together. And unfortunately, Lieutenant Coulter is part of that. And Bruno starts to watch Pavel a little bit more closely and sees that over time he becomes weaker, probably less energized. He looks like he is thinning and all those sorts of things. So he's actually paying attention. He's looking at what's some of the changes in this person here. And he noticed that after some time, when Pavel came in with the plates, Bruno couldn't help but notice that his hands were shaking slightly under the weight of them. So he's weakening. He's not able to sustain the sort of workload that he's under at the moment. And when he stepped back to his usual position, he seemed to sway on his feet and had to press a hand against the wall to steady himself. Mother had to ask twice for extra helping of soup before he heard her. And he let the bottle of wine empty without having opened another one in time to fill Father's glass. Like, what catastrophic mistakes he's making. I mean, how horrendous that he do those things. When you consider the conditions that he lives and works in, I would expect those things to happen far more often. Okay, but these are the things that Bruno sees in someone and goes, well, there's something wrong. Not, well, there's something wrong with us expecting him to do this for us anyway. Because Bruno doesn't realise that he doesn't get paid for it. He doesn't realise that he is essentially a slave. And Bruno carries on going about, her list doesn't let us read poetry and plays, which leads into this discussion about history. And the father sort of chimes in, and it's important that it's come from the father here because it's, I suppose, much more serious and much more... it's much more stern coming from the father here. Because Bruno says, I'm starting to hate history, I'm starting to hate geography, because that's all we ever do. And the father says, if it wasn't for history, none of us would be sitting here around this table now. We'd be safely back at our table in our house in Berlin. We are correcting history here. So that's his justification. They are correcting history. Now, Bruno's not going to get that. Bruno doesn't understand what they're doing and why we have this division in society and why one group's being persecuted over another. But this is, I suppose, the father trying to capture what it is from the Nazi point of view for us as an audience, more so than for Bruno himself. Okay? And that's kind of it. That's the end of that discussion, because that's, as we know, that once the father says something like that, that's really where it all ends. Okay? From here on in, it does sort of slow down a little bit. We get just the usual conversation, bit of family conversation going on here. Gretel and Bruno are still sort of fighting at each other and grumbling at each other, and Lieutenant Kotler rather, joins into the conversation a little bit more, but doesn't really seem to fit in. Okay, he's a very different sort of character that doesn't fit really into this family life. And we get the feeling too that Mother doesn't really like that part of it as well. All right. And of course, we find out here that Lieutenant Kotler has an interesting relationship with his own father. Because his father, it says here, was a professor of literature. Now, you should obviously be aware from some of the background research that we've done before that when the Nazis came to power, one of the things that they used to do was have these very public book burnings. And so unless it was a book that was approved by the Nazis, it wasn't a book that anyone was really allowed to have, because they wanted to control ideas. They didn't want people to sort of think for themselves too much. So it was another form of, I suppose, like media censorship. And Kotler's put in this position by the end of the chapter here to basically say, well, I disagree with my father and I kind of disown my father, which he only says in order to sustain his position within the Nazi leadership, the Nazi ranks and those sorts of things. And I like how the mother says, because Kotler reveals, the last I heard, he was teaching at a university in Bern. And of course, Mum pipes up, oh, but Switzerland's a beautiful country, said Mother, quickly. I haven't ever been there, I admit, but from what I hear, and of course, we get that sort of superficial reaction from the mother again, look what things look like, how beautiful they are, how they appear in a visual sort of way, rather than the actual deeper understanding of what's going on in that relationship. Okay. And it continues through, and he starts to distance himself. He goes, we are not close, my father and I, said Lieutenant Kotler, quickly, looking around the table as if he owed everyone an explanation. Really, we haven't spoken in years. So he doesn't want to sort of claim that they have this sort of close relationship in any way, shape or form. All right. And if we see how awkward it gets by the time we get to paragraphs like this, with government policy, one hears tales of men like this from time to time, curious fellows, I imagine, disturbed, some of them traitors, others cowards too. Of course, you have informed your superiors of your father's views, Lieutenant Kotler. So the father's chiming in and saying, if you believe that your father is not someone who is to be trusted, he has to go and report that, because that's, you know, the sort of suspicious behaviour that the Nazis really can't allow to continue. And it gets quite heated. It gets quite awkward. And you can imagine the kids sitting around watching this unfold. The father's just turned into the commandant. He's no longer a father figure. He's an officer practically reprimanding another officer within the, you know, the Nazi ranks. And that's not something they would have really seen before. Okay? And it would have been quite frightening. And of course, they just say, perhaps it's something that must be discussed at another time. Perhaps this is something that we need to think about, look at a little bit later on. And they turn the conversation into something else so that it doesn't end on that sort of negative light. Otherwise, it would be a little bit tricky. And of course, let me just go back and finish this quote. "What's the matter with you tonight?" he asked Pavel, as Pavel uncorked, went back to the wrong page, a new bottle of wine. This is the fourth time I've had to ask for more wine. So we've kind of got this repetition of this idea here. We're getting a few examples of this again. And as Pavel's gone to pour the wine, he's lost his grip and it's gone all over the table. And what happened then was both unexpected and extremely unpleasant. Lieutenant Kotler grew very angry with Pavel, and no one, not Bruno, not Gretel, not Mother, and not even Father stepped in to stop him doing what he did next, even though none of them could watch, even though it made Bruno cry and Gretel grow pale. It doesn't tell us what he did. It's very ambiguous. But I like the fact that it names each person in that room individually and says none of them did anything to stop him. Because that's the question that everyone asks about the Holocaust. If all these people were there, all these people witnessed it, all these people knew it was going on, but no one stepped in to stop it, how could that possibly occur? So this little incident here, this one incident of this Jewish person being reprimanded, and I'm assuming that he was beaten. Okay, I'm assuming that he was physically beaten up by Kotler, is a symbol, is sort of a really small version, if you like, of what was happening on a much grander scale outside in the camps. And no one stepped up to stop it. And it made Bruno cry, which is a great reaction, because that's how most kids would have responded to that. They don't like seeing death. They don't like seeing destruction. They like seeing things that are happy and joyous. So it's a good, I suppose, example of how things should have, how people should have responded, not just by turning a blind eye. And of course, this plays on Bruno's mind. He's not happy with what's going on there. And then he starts to think more about his old life. And he misses all the people that he used to be with. He doesn't like this place anymore, because if he's surrounded by characters like Lieutenant Kotler, he's not going to be a happy person.